Okay, great. Well, let's get started. I'll just do a quick introduction. My name is Anna Arcturus. I am an Air Force Association member. I have been for about 7 years, and I'm also part of their Emerging Leader Program for this year. And what we're aiming to do is we started a YouTube channel to collect diverse stories that motivate our members to want to do big things in the community and also motivate the next generation of aerospace leaders. And so when I read about you, Dr. Brown, I thought, oh my gosh, we have to have him on the channel. So thank you so much for joining us. And I'm going to be asking you questions about your book, which was a fascinating read. It's Keep Your Airspeed Up. And so I was wondering if you could start with an introduction.
Well, this goes back, roughly some 7, 8, 9 years or so ago, when it was decided that we were going to write a book. And even that decision was not firm at the time. But in the meantime, my brother and I was creating a lot of information that was available in the event that we wanted to write a book. And Marsha then decided, okay, let's do it. So over, some period of time, I don't know, probably a good 2 years or more of her writing and whatnot, the book, and we were fortunate enough to know a few people down in Maxwell Air Force Base at the War College. We became friends with, and we used them as readers of the book, chapter by chapter, just to make sure it was reasonably accurate, and it was. And then, lo and behold, after she does all that work, at the time they get ready to publish, they say, well, guess what? It's too big. Delete some 25,000 words, which is okay. So she does that, and then we get the final book after that occurred. So that's just a little background on how, the book came into being, and some of the things that we went through just to get the book published, whatnot.
Yes. Yes, and for those of you who are watching who are not familiar with Dr. Brown, he is a Tuskegee Airman. He also had experience post your career, sir, in academia. You got your PhD. And so I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about your background.
Well, let me see, where should we begin? Way back yonder, I'll have to go way, way back about 80, 90 years. So I'm 97 years old now. And, but I grew up in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And keep in mind, I was born in 1924. The Big Depression started in 1929. My mother always had hoped or thought that I would become a pianist. And I was dutifully taking my little piano lessons, practicing regularly. And this is the way I thought that my whole career was going to become. Well, someplace along the line, I fell in love with airplanes. I don't know when, I don't know how, but one day I decided I'm going to become a military pilot. Now, keep in mind that this was at a time when airplanes were still a very strange thing that was flying around, and nobody knew for sure how it stayed up there. And every time a little Piper would come putt-putting along, everybody would look up and say, oh, there goes an airplane. So this whole idea of flying was just beginning. And Mom and Dad, they know absolutely nothing about it. As a matter of fact, when I mentioned I was going to become a military pilot, she says, well, what's that? What are you talking about? And that is what we were faced with. Well, that all happened when I was about 11 years old. I made up my mind that that's what I was going to become. I was in the sixth grade, and I had my uncle Cosal, who one day took me out to World Chamberlain Air Force Base. And this is a few years later. I worked in the drugstore. I saved up a whole $35, and we went out to World Chamberlain Airport. And I found the fixed base operator and said, I want to take flying lessons. He says, I can give you flying lessons. He says, but it will cost you $7 an hour dual instructions. I said, well, I got 35. He says, I will get you 5 lessons. And then where are you going to go? That's not enough for you to solo. So I said, well, by then I'll have another $35 so I can finish it off. Well, obviously I didn't. It had taken me God knows how long to save that $35, which was a lot of money back in those days. So I took my little 5 flying lessons, and that was the end of my flying career. Now, all of that happened after I had decided that this is what I want to become, a military pilot. And this occurred when I was 16 years old, 5 years after I had made that decision. So that was the end of my flying career. I then graduated from high school, 17 years old, and we had a small group of us at North High School who was interested in flying. And we had a small flying club. And we were all about to graduate, and I made a suggestion, well, let's all go down and set for the exam together. And I could get no takers. And I said, now, wait a minute. You guys want to become pilots, but you don't want to go down. You can't afford flying lessons on your own. There, you could join the military. You can get all the flying lessons you want free of charge. This is a no-brainer. No. So I go down by myself, and I passed all of the exams. And they finally, at that time, I turned 18 that August, and they told me, well, it will still be a few months, and you should hear something back from the Air Force. And I can remember going to one of my instructors in high school, and very good friend, and I told him what I had done, and this is what I was hoping that would happen, that I would be selected to go into flying school in the military. But I said, all they're doing is having me wait. So he kind of looked into it, and he came back, and we had a nice conversation. And what it amounted to was the same old thing. Mm-hmm. They had started arguing back in 1939 whether or not they even want to train those guys. Mm-hmm. Not intelligent enough, and you know the routine and all the things that were said. Nope, don't have the intelligence, so waste of money. We aren't going to waste our money on these guys and so forth. And finally, that went on for 2 years. And in 1941, Roosevelt said, well, let's train one squadron of them. And he made that decision in March of 1941. Mm-hmm. So that started the whole thing off. But everything was still by quota. Mm-hmm. And that was the reason why, after I took my exams, all the other guys that didn't look like me were immediately set aside and were just waiting for a class assignment. In my case, they could not give me a class assignment. The decision had to come from Washington, D.C., because there is where the selection was made. Now, they're only going to handle nothing but a few of us. And they had literally thousands of applicants, of people who wanted to come in for flight training. I got word in December of 19 42 that I had been selected. And of course, I was extremely happy about it. And I was nothing, just a little high school graduate. There were a lot of those guys that had college training and everything else who had made application of it. But, quote, it was the quota. And the quota was the worst thing in the world because my whole life was based upon quotas.
Wow.
Everything was done on a quota. There's only going to be so many. So
what kept you motivated? What kept you motivated despite these kind of challenges? I was wondering that throughout the book, like what actually kept you motivated to keep trying?
That's what I wanted, and I made up my mind. I don't know, generally speaking, as I made up my mind to do something, and that became one of my objectives, then it was just part of my nature. That is what I wanted. That is what I was going to achieve, and I was willing to work hard enough to do it. And if you want it, you got to work for it. Nothing comes free. And
true of McGee too. True of McGee and other Tuskegee Airmen, I think.
Oh yes. Mm-hmm.
Yes, and I'm very fascinated by your parents. You give a really beautiful account on their character and what they were like, and you even said your mother was a bit rebellious. So how did their personalities play into your entire journey to become a Tuskegee Airman? You know, how did that work?
To be quite honest, they had very little to do with it because when I made that decision, they had no idea of what I was even talking about. I mean, but they were supporting it. Initially, they argued against it, but Ma finally came around. She says, well, okay, this is what you want to do, fine. But my mother was pulled out of school when she was in the 6th grade down in Alabama to go out and work in the cotton fields. And that was all of the background and education that she had. My father was the last of 9 children in his family, born in Jennifer, Alabama. And he went to Talladega College for 1 year after they had relocated from Jennifer up to Talladega, Alabama. So he had a little college.
Mm-hmm.
But when it came to flying, none of them knew one thing about flying.
My gosh.
And they questioned me about it, and I said, no, this is what I'm going to become. They said, well, okay, if this is what you want, then fine. And that's...
What did they say when they saw you graduate? I'm just showing the audience your picture.
Well,
they must have been so floored, blown away.
I came home, after graduation, 1 whole week before I went away to fighter training. A brand new second lieutenant wearing a pair of wings. Now, it was not common to see guys like me even wearing a little second lieutenant barge.
Yes.
But to have wings on, everyone treated us as if we were so very, very special. And we were.
You were.
But this is the way that it was. We were a very, very select who were going to become pilots who flying aircraft. And I can remember people saying, do you really fly an airplane, Harold? And they looked at that and said, that's this unbelievable thinking. But keep in mind, we were going way, way back into the 40s. That was what, 80, 90 years ago, whoever it was. And flying was just becoming popular at that time. And it wasn't that long since World War I when they flew the first combat aircraft. So this is what it was. And yeah, my dad was very proud of me. I remember I went to church with Ma. They were good Seventh-day Adventists, good church-going people. And I went to church with them the one day that I was home with them after graduation. And they were looking at me, and I swore that I was on a pedestal this high, you know. Well, one of our own is a pilot, and he really flies. And I can remember the little kids coming up. Do you really fly an airplane? Really? You know, unbelievable. But this is the way it was. It
Yes.
was an occupation that we were not familiar with.
Yes. And then going into World War II, in the book, you have incredible stories about what it was like to be a Tuskegee Airman and, you know, protect the bombers. And one of the most surprising things I found in your experience was the engines that would have mishaps and inheriting old models. So could you talk a little bit more about how you guys overcame that?
Well, at that time, the aircraft were rapidly changing,
Mhm.
and it didn't take long before a new modification would come out. But the basic airplane was there, and it never changed, really. The problems that we faced, yeah, they were problems, but they were general problems that every fighter group or whatnot faced. And it wasn't peculiar just to us. Granted, we often got the used one because when the P-51s came overseas, they were flying P-47s.
Mhm.
There were only there were only 7 fighter groups in the 15th Air Force at that time. 4 of them were flying the single engine. And I don't know, have you ever heard of a P-38?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Then 3 of them were flying 38. But it was the 51s that started off with the C models. And so we were flying the old P-47s at that time.
Mm-hmm.
We were the last group to get the P-51Cs. And those were, well, hand-me-downs, let's say. Okay.
Yes.
But they still flew okay.
Okay.
But they weren't the latest. And then when the new P-51D models started coming out with the fancy bubble top, and same old thing, when the other outfit got theirs, then we got ours. Okay. So we finally got them. It made not that big of a deal, but it was interesting the way things always occurred. Yep, we got it, but we were always the last one to get it.
Wow.
So that's the way it is. Those are the cards that we were dealt with, and the cards that we had to play with.
Did you ever have any, I don't want to say fear, but just what was going through your mind as you're getting in this aircraft, you're going to protect bombers, you don't know what's going to happen with the engine. Like, how did you manage that?
Loved it.
Oh my gosh. I can tell you do. Here's another picture for the viewers.
Oh yeah, those were 3-year-old buddies. That was after the war. Yeah. And we came back to Tuskegee, and we were flight instructors down there. But flying has its own, problems, and you knew what they were, and those are the ones that you were on guard against. The most dangerous part of all of our flying was taking that aircraft off, because we were heavily loaded with fuel and with ammunition and fuel tank external, and it was at its maximum gross weight, and you're running down the runway, and you're just hoping that, hey, I hope this engine keeps running until I get airborne.
My gosh.
And once you were airborne, then the most difficult part of the engine, of the whole mission, was completed. once you got airborne. The rest of the mission was really fairly empty. I mean, was really fairly simple. But we would pick up the bombers, and actually, when you picked up the bombers, the first 4 or 5 hours of your mission was really quite boring, to be very honest. You're all just sitting up here in this great big mass formation with nothing to do, except of course, we're keeping our eyes out in case you don't get jumped by enemy aircraft. But other than that, that got a little boring. And you're just ginning along in this aircraft, hoping that this engine will get you there and get you back home. Then after you get very, very close to the target, now it got a little more interesting. Because if anything was going to happen, this is where the Germans were going to hit the bombers before it. So for the next hour or so, now you are fully wrapped up with really the guts of the whole mission. Took just about an hour to get those bombers over target, off the target, and get them on their way home.
Wow.
And for an hour out of 6 or 7 hours, out of 7 hours, you were bored to death, but during 1 hour of that flying time, you were very much alert, right on your toes, waiting for the other enemy aircraft. Are they going to jump us or are they not? Sometimes they would fly around and leave us alone. Other times they would attack the bomber. And then it got a little more interesting.
Yes, in your book, you have a fascinating experience that you share on your plane getting shot down and the crash. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Now, what part of that is it?
Oh, not shot down. I'm sorry, but your plane crashed.
Oh, okay. So I tore up a couple of airplanes. The first one on the 12th mission, a dogfight with ME-262 with one of the jet bombers. And in the final analysis, I got low on fuel after the dogfight and whatnot. Was trying to get back home. I had fuel exhaust at 25,000 feet. So what do? Well, there's the old saying is that a fighter pilot can make a decision just like that within a matter of seconds. But if you give him time, he'll sit there and never make a decision.
Wow.
So here I am sitting there with all this time on my hands at 25,000 feet, no engine. And I had time to think, which is all bad news.
Oh, no.
So it gets out to 20,000. What are you going to do here? I don't know. I'll worry about it later. 15, 10, 5,000 feet. Now you either decide something, you're going to jump or you're going to crash, man. Well, fortunately, I spotted an old abandoned landing strip. I said, I've got it made. You know, I'm going to land on there. But only to find out that it wasn't long enough. So I had to belly the aircraft in, tore the aircraft to pieces. There was a big ditch in the center of the little landing strip. And, but, you know, I got out of it, no big deal. Didn't get a scratch and didn't bother me that much. Hey, they say any landing that you can walk away from is a good landing. So even though I had an airplane that was totally destroyed, it broke in half right behind my canopy. Still a good landing. I walked away from it.
But the next one was a bit more complicated.
Well, the other one I had to jump out of.
Yes.
So, yeah, and we were on a strafing mission, and we went in on this locomotive, and just as the locomotive blew up, I was just passing over the locomotive at a very low altitude, obviously. You know, we were strafing. You know what strafing is, hitting all of the ground targets and whatnot.
Yes.
Yeah. And the explosion, I got caught in the explosion and came out of it. And all I could think of is wait until I get home and I see these beautiful pictures, because I went through the whole target with my hand, with my guns firing. So I couldn't wait until we got back to base, and I looked at my gun cameras because I had some beautiful pictures. Well, that didn't happen. After a while, the old engine starts acting up, and I had to bail out of it. And I wound up a POW for the last few months of the war.
Wow. I know there's a lot that plays into surviving something like that, but what do you think really helped you survive and get through all that the most?
Well, it takes a lot of luck. And a lot of things that happen to me, yeah, you can be the greatest pilot in the world, but doing those things, you also have to have a whole lot of luck. And if you have a choice between being very lucky or very skillful, I'll always be very lucky rather than very skillful. Because in many situations, you can have all the skills in the world and you aren't going to get out of it.
Yeah.
But with a little luck, you might survive. And that was my case. I was lucky and I just survived. Because you look at all of the guys that I knew that went down and whatnot that weren't fortunate enough as I was, that wound up, killing themselves.
Yeah.
That's just what. Yeah.
Yeah. In the book, you talk about even just the difference in where you crash really makes a difference, how the population receives you there. I know there was a gentleman, I think a German gentleman, who was really instrumental in kind of protecting you when you first crashed, and just that one person changed the course of that experience, which was amazing.
It saved my life.
Yeah.
Because there were about 35, 40 angry civilians who wanted a piece of me, and they were going to do it and take it. And I was looking death right in the face.
Yeah.
And, you often think about those things and you talk about them kind of jokingly. But when you're standing right there and it's in front of your face, and here I am, a little 20-year-old guy at this time, thinking that, don't tell me I'm going to die at 20 years. And I finally concluded that, yeah, unless something happens, you are going to die. It's in a very, very short period of time. And that was when the policeman, just pure unadulterated luck, put a hand on my shoulder, pulled me back, stepped in front of me, put a round in his rifle, and kept the others from killing me. Now, he knew everybody in that crowd. They all had to be his friends and everyone else.
Wow.
And yet, and still, he stopped them from doing what they were going to do. But there were a number of guys I knew that was in the exact same situation, and it didn't happen. And they were not as lucky as I was. And they wound up dying.
Wow. And to this day, do you know why that gentleman helped you? Could you speak to each other or not really?
Let me tell you the story. I've often thought about, when I came home, I was still a young guy, 20 years old. And going back to Germany is the last thing on my mind. But as I got a little older, I started, and I thought more and more about how he saved my life. I thought, Harold, go back over to Germany, go back to that village. And I knew right where it happened. And that guy might still be alive. And just go in and say, hey, thank you for saving my life. Do you remember way back yonder, the guy, the pilot, who you saved his life, or you saved him from the mob? And thank him. Hey, I owe you my life. And I thought about it and I thought about it. I said I was going to do it. And guess what? I never did it. But that's the one thing I think I will regret more than anything else that ever happened to me. The fact that I did not take the time to make that little 2-week trip, go over to Germany and do what I had to do, find the guy and thank him. But I never did it. And I'll regret it to this day that I never did it.
But in a way, you know, his memory lives on in this book and all the interviews that you do. It helps you understand the nature of war is complicated and it's not so simple as enemy and non-enemy. You know, there's good everywhere, everywhere. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about your interaction with, let me see. Here it is. General Davis.
Oh, Bill Davis. Oh, yeah.
The legend. I mean, every Air Force person who goes through, you know, enlisted basic training or, you know, goes through OTS like I did, or both rather, you know about the first African-American, you know, general in the Air Force, and you actually had direct contact with him. Could you describe that a little bit?
Yeah. Well, a little background on Bill Davis. He came from a military family. And in 1932, he went to West Point. 4 years. He lived by himself. He was not spoken to except in an official capacity, lived by himself, gave him the so-called silent treatment, and graduated in 1936. Then for the next 4 or 5 years, matter of fact, he wound up down in Tuskegee as a ROTC instructor. And his father knew how unhappy he was. He was out in Kansas at that time, and he was now a 1-star general. So he said, well, why don't you come on out and be my assistant, which he did. And he wasn't out there that long when it was after Roosevelt decided to train a squadron of them. The first thing that they did was to call General Davis and say, hey, your son, the West Point graduate, is going to lead this outfit.
Wow.
So have your son apply for flight training. Well, interesting enough, when Bill Davis graduated, he graduated 35 out of a class of 276. When you graduate that high in the class, you get your choice. So he says, I want to become a fighter pilot. And the response was, ha, 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 no, you can't become a fighter pilot. There are no black pilots. No, 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 no. And now, some X number of years later, the Air Force is telling his father to have him apply for flight training, which he would have done anyway. You know, it's just what he wanted. So this is how Davis comes back to Tuskegee. He was a captain at that time and goes through the first class of 13 guys who was in the first class to graduate. And but it was kind of interesting how things, you know, work out. And but he was highly respected, strictly military. He's about 6 foot 2 inches tall, a thin man. And matter of fact, behind his back, they used to refer to him as the thin man. But he was tall, slim guy. And I mean, all military, wow. All military. And, but he was a good commander. And he really did a great job at getting all of us other young guys who were young pilots and all the rest of us. He really got us ready for the change that we didn't know but we knew it was going to come eventually. And of course, that happened in 1948 when Truman said he was going to integrate the military, which he did. He announced it in 48, and in 1949, that is when it began happening. A lot of the guys left the military, but those who did stayed in. We went to the four winds, which is probably the best thing that ever happened.
Wow. So it sounds like a phenomenal leader. Would you say he was a big influence or maybe someone else was a big influence on your leadership perspective as you went through your experiences in World War II all the way through the Cuban Missile Crisis? Because you had a long career, over 20 years. Was he important to shaping you?
Everyone had the utmost respect for the guy, but he had his life and you have your life.
Yeah.
And yes, I respected him, thought the world of it, but he went in his direction, I went in my direction. He becomes eventually a 4-star general. I become a lieutenant colonel. There's no,
Yeah.
But yes,
So what did you do? Because obviously you flew in World War II and then you had your career continued after that. Do you have anything particular about your career that were your favorite things or your favorite spots or favorite assignments?
Well, it was interesting. The first half of my career, I was primarily a fighter pilot.
Mm-hmm.
And I flew, all of the subsonic jets and whatnot, 80s, 84s, 86s. I flew all of those jets. And I ran into a wonderful job because I was at the depot over in the Far East Air Material Command. And everything that cannot be done at the squadron level comes into the depot. And all the aircraft that had to be repaired all had to be test flown. So I knew the guy who was over flight test, Major Kelly, all by himself. So I went to him one day, I said, Major Kelly, could you use any help and whatnot? He said, are you volunteering to help me? I said, yeah. I said, I would love, I'll fly anything, I would love to do it. So I did. And there is where that was the best flying experience I've ever had throughout my entire military career. At one time, I was current in something like 13, 14 different aircraft.
Wow.
Everything from a little light Army aircraft like an L-19, flight test that they come in, jumping an F-86 to fly it. And then I was flying multi-aircraft. So I was flying the C-47, between Japan and Korea. I was flying everything. And like I say, it was the best flying experience, the best assignment I've ever had in my life because it gave me the opportunity to do just what I wanted to do, fly everything that was available. And I did it.
And that was at the depot.
Yeah, that was the 3 years when I was in Air Material Command for 3 years, from 1950 to 1953. I was over in the Far East, over at Japan at the time.
Excellent.
Best assignment I ever had.
That's excellent. And even after you ended your career in the military, I mean, you're a person that looks like you just keep going. You're always working on things because then you got into academia, right? Could you describe that? I mean, how did that transition go?
Okay, well, the first half I was a fighter pilot. The second half I was a bomber pilot, which I thought would never happen. Oh. Never. We were training navigators down at Ellington Air Force Base. And they were aborting a lot of missions for a little simple reason. They had a pilot, a co-pilot, and I am now talking about the B-47, the first six-jet engine bomber. And we had 1,450 of them at the time. And we were really the very, front line of defense. And a third of the fleet was always ready to go. At that time, have you ever heard of a general by the name of Curtis LeMay?
Yes, I have.
Okay.
Yes.
He ran SAC, and he ran SAC just the way he wanted to SAC to run. And I mean, well, long story short, he was a good commander, but he was a tough one.
Yeah, I've heard.
And that was the first line of defense was SAC, because a third of the fleet was always ready to go to war. And like I said, with 1,450 B-47s, they would carry one weapon that just barely fit into the belly of that aircraft. And it was a megaton weapon. And they had all of this redundancy built into the fleet. That is, for every target, they had 8, 9, 10 aircraft, whatever it was, depending upon the size of the target, was all assigned that target. And all you had to do was to get one airplane through. Now, they knew they were going to lose aircraft if they had to go to war, but they had all this redundancy because out of the 10, they figure one would get through. And if one gets through with the weapon they had on board, that was the end of the target. The target would just be obliterated. And this is how he, felt. And this is how he ran SAC. And they used to say there's only two kinds of people, those who are in SAC and those who have yet to go into SAC, because everybody dodged SAC. Nobody wanted it. But that's how I spent my last 10 years in SAC. And of course, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, I had moved up. I had given up crew duty when I was in the command post up in Lockburn, the 801st Air Division. And we had two bomb groups up there, the 301st and the 376 bomb group. And I was in the command post. And like I said, when that whole Cuban crisis occurred, and no one knew what in the world was going to happen. As a matter of fact, being in the command post is interesting because you work in the command post at that time. The only person who could launch an aircraft was a controller in the command post. Even the CEO of the 376 bomb wing, and I was in that his command post, he could ride with me in the car if the war started, and we hit the button for those guys going off and taking off. If I wasn't there, he couldn't say, hey, you guys are going to war, go. He couldn't do it, and he wouldn't listen to him. Only a controller could do it. But that is the way that LeMay set it up, was by a series of command posts, and he telling his top command post, this is what we're going to do, and they would pass it down to each command post where there was, a SAC base.
Yeah, and that was your role. So at that point, had you stopped flying and you were just doing the command post?
Oh, no. I was the old instructor pilot by that time. And whenever the CO flew, he always would come in, Harold, when are you flying? I said, well, on my days off, I work, something like 3 days on, 3 days off, 12-hour days in the command post. And he knew what days was off. Hey, Harold, you're off for such and such. I'm going to fly with you. And whenever he needed his flying time, I always flew with him. I was his favorite, but he would climb on board. I said, what are you doing? Getting your flight pay? Nice and easy.
flight pay.
Yeah, you know, you got to fly X number of hours to get that flight pay.
Yes.
But it was a good life, an interesting life. And I don't know, it seemed as if back in those days, so much was going on, you know, and well, you know, all the stuff that was going on.
I do.
But it was interesting.
Yeah. Do you ever miss it, or do you still fly at all, or are you still?
Well, you know, after I left the military,
Yeah.
I said goodbye to it, and it became something that I used to do.
Mhm.
And then all my energy was in my new job. And that's when I went back to school, got a master's, PhD, and whatnot. And I was with the Columbus Community College, the vice president for academic affairs. And that was my second career.
How did it compare to flying? I imagine very different. But what attracted you into changing course like that and starting a whole nother career?
Well, you know, in my whole military career, I was always an instructor pilot.
Mm-hmm.
By instructor pilot, you're talking about instructions. And that was throughout my whole career. I was an instructor pilot throughout that entire time. So instructions was nothing new to me. And it was, you know, the ideal thing. And in particular, to go into, at that time, you've heard of community colleges and so forth.
Yeah.
Well, they were just really getting started. And back in Ohio, there was only a couple of them even going on. And we were just starting the community college system.
Okay.
And that was just perfect for me. And that's what I went into. And I had a good career. And I stayed in it for 21 years. And then the president or someone was stupid enough to say, hey, you can buy 5 of your military career, years for military service, which I immediately did. And then they came up with another program and they let you do the same thing. I said, I've already have used 5 years. Are you letting me use another 5 years? I said, that's dumb, but I'll take it. And then finally, about 6 months later, they said, oh no, great big mistake. We can't do that. We're giving them, taking 5 years for one. He uses the same 5 years for the next one. So I wound up retiring with 32 years of service. Yeah.
I need to play my cards better. That's amazing. That's amazing. So yeah, in the as I mentioned, I'm part of the Air Force Association, and education is so huge, not just aerospace, but STEM education.
Oh, it's a whole new ball game.
Right.
Everything is education now. Without that, there's almost nothing, really, if you expect to move up or go into some of the new fancier, jobs which are being developed as a result of, and technology is moving so fast, you can hardly keep up with it. And, so education is the name of the game.
Absolutely. When you were actually going through the Air Force, and even after the Air Force, had you ever heard about the Air Force Association, maybe when you were flying or in the military or afterwards?
And it was just about 10 years ago, a friend of mine down in Florida suggested, hey, Harold, why don't you join our Air Force Association and whatnot? And they had a nice big one down in Florida. He says, why don't you join it? I said, well, okay. Yeah, I'll join it, And I don't know, I think the dues were something like $45 or a year or something. I don't know, some small amount. So I did.
we've got a few chapters here in Florida. Maybe you've heard of the Air Warfare Symposium. We just had that, about a week ago. And, people from all over the country at different chapters, they're getting together. They're talking about Air Force history, where the Air Force is going. And also some of the cool things that we're doing, like Cyber Patriots and Stellar Explorers and all these science programs to help kids get excited about science.
Yeah. I think it's neat. And it's just wonderful. And it doesn't surprise me that it is happening. If you look, we haven't, after we lost the B-47 bombers, we had the B-52s. As a matter of fact, during my period of time, we had about 81. Right now, we got about 50 B-52. Those things are almost, 65 years old, and we haven't had a new bomber since.
Yes.
You don't need bombers when you got all these missiles in the ground all over the place. So everything has changed. It's a whole different world out there.
Yeah. And as from your perspective as, an instructor in academics and having a flying background, what do you think would benefit, this generation in terms of developing them as future leaders, future DoD leaders? What do you think that they really, really need to know about education and its importance?
Oh, I think it's a wonderful time for them to be alive. I only wish that right about now that I was about 18, 19, 20 years old, and I was just getting started. Because I think over the next 20, 30 years, you're going to see things happening that is just going to be fantastic. And it's all going to be based on education.
Yeah.
That's it. Without it, you got nothing. Absolutely nothing. Yeah. My wife was head of a community college, the president of a community college up in Ohio where we're at before she retired. And and I look at a number of those kids who are getting out and jobs and things that they're going into. Oh, God, it's just a wonderful time to be alive, I think. And then particularly if you're into that level of technology.
Yeah,
everything available. And
what
you
do you
can take your choices, but you got to work at it. You got to stay in school. And the 2 years, they get a good education. There's tons of jobs they can do. But if they want to move and get into the more sophisticated things, you got to go back, get your baccalaureate, get your master's and such and such. Yeah. You just don't have enough. You got to get all of it.
Yeah. And one of the things that I think is really exciting, especially right now, is this whole field of space, space launch, maybe space planes someday, basically leaving orbit one day. And what the Air Force Association is doing now is, we really are the Air and Space Association now, bringing those two things together under one Air Force. What are your thoughts on this future in space, and especially from where you've been?
I only wish that I knew more about it, because I am really pretty ignorant about a lot of the stuff that is going on. Because there was a period of time when I was just doing other things.
Yeah.
And even though I was spending a little time, trying to keep up to date, I never really did. But there is so much exciting stuff going on at this time that, if we were to have a conversation 15 years from now, I bet it'd be one of the most exciting conversations we would ever want to have. Because when we started looking about what is going on, not in airspace, well, and not only in the near airspace, but even beyond that. Yeah, from ground zero up to about 200, 250 miles or so, there's an awful lot going on. And there will be even more stuff going on. But then you get beyond 250 miles and you start going out to the next planet or so, because they will be going out to Mars. And it isn't going to take that long. So,
Can you
boy,
imagine space pilots?
It's going to be an interesting time to be alive. So I think a lot of neat things are going to happen.
Oh, it was so great to talk to you, Dr. Brown. I mean, your experience as a Tuskegee Airman, I mean, for most of us that cannot imagine what you went through in that time, it's really amazing. And again, I just want to encourage everyone to read your book. There is just so much good stuff in here. And I just really appreciate the chance to talk to you and glean some wisdom.
It's a lot of fun. Okay.
Yes.
Whatever it was. Yeah. Because I could sit up here and yak with you for the rest of the day if you got nothing better to do.
No, it's really great. And because, all of us joined the Air Force. I mean, I'm active duty. I've been in for 12 years, planes is what we know and it's what we're passionate about. But now the space is coming in and, it's just exciting. It's really exciting.
It is. But again, it all goes back to what? Education.
Yes.
That's where it all starts.
Yeah. And that's really what got me into the Air Force Association, especially thinking about, underprivileged schools. I just visited one in the local area this past week, kids that just don't have access to a lot of resources. It's these organizations that are pushing cyber and STEM and aerospace like the AFA. I mean, really, it's critical. Otherwise, these kids might fall behind, and you never know. You could have a superstar and never know if they don't get that access to education and resources.
Where are you at right now? Are you in Florida?
I am. Do you know where the Cape Canaveral area is?
Cape Canaveral. We used to watch rockets go off all the time.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So now we're Patrick Space Force Base, but that's where I work. Used to be Patrick Air Force Base.
Oh, yes. As a matter of fact, that used to be an old SAC base.
Oh.
At Patrick. Yeah, a big SAC base.
Really?
It was right at Patrick Henry Air Force Base.
Yeah, we do have a runway here, so that makes sense.
Yeah. And I bet you got a long one. 10,000, 12,000 feet long.
Yeah. And here they call it the Space Coast because NASA's here and they launch rockets from here. And, a lot of the local schools are getting into aerospace education. And that's really our mission, is to expand really everywhere that reach for especially for kids and young people to, get excited about it and see a future in it. So, but yeah, I really appreciate interviewing you, Dr. Brown. I could also talk to you guys all day, but I will respect your time. But we're going to share this video.
I enjoyed it.
Oh, yes.
It was a lot of fun.
Do you have any speaking engagements coming up or anything that we could?
I've got a list of things. As a matter of fact, Marsha and we are going to learn how to say no.
Good. I understand that.
We are going to learn how to do that. Because if we don't, we aren't going to have much of a life. As it is, it's always, now, you got this. Keep in mind, as a matter of fact, we had, you were this morning, let me see. There was one coming in Monday. We have another,
for the Library of Congress.
Good Life. As a matter of fact, they're going to come here to the house. And that's going to be a 2 or 3 hour session, whatever it is. And when they leave, there's always something. And we have, and not that it isn't a lot of fun, it is. But I do have another life. And I
You
hope
earned
I
it.
get a chance to enjoy it. I don't think so.
You've earned it. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
not a gift, but as Tuskegee guys are dying, there's only 7 of us left.
Oh,
You
I
know,
didn't know
pilots
that.
that went overseas to fight the war. Out of the 355 of us that went overseas to fight the war, there's only 7 of us left. One of us, my very dear friend, Charles McGee, he just passed away. I don't know, 2 or 3 weeks or so ago, 3 weeks or so ago. Very, very dear friend. Was one of the early guys that came in, you know, to the military. But I was fortunate enough to do a number of things with him before he passed. But
Wow.
he was 102, and
Wow.
it was a good life. So,
Well, you're motivating me. That's what I tell my mom. Hey, Mom, we're going to live to 108. Don't worry. And she just laughs at me. And I'm like, come on. You just got to decide 108.
good deal. Hey,
Well, it was great to speak with you guys. Thank you so much. We're just so appreciative for your time, and thank you very much for your service. I mean
My
that from the
pleasure.
bottom of my heart. Thank you.
my
And thank you,
pleasure.
Marsha.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marsha. You guys have a
All right. She's hollering, you're welcome. I know if you heard her or not.
yes. Thank you. Thank
Okay.
Well, have a
good
great
luck to
day.
you. All right. Now, if you have a little luck in your programs and whatnot, but you will.
Thank you. Thank you,
Okay.
sir. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.